Hello, and thank you for taking the time to check out another SmartCap webinar. My name's Dan Bonges, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer for SmartCap Technologies. During these webinars, we want to share what we've learned with and from our customers around the world over the last 12 years, by taking a bit of a deeper dive into some specific areas of a fatigue monitoring initiative that can help your workforce get home safe every day. Our previous topic was the interaction between a supervisor and a professional driver or equipment operator following an escalated fatigue alarm, and how to get the most out of that conversation. Today's topic focuses on a point much earlier in the progression towards business intervention. We're taking a look at empowering your workforce to self-manage at the point where the very early signs of impairment hit, what steps work best, and how good self-management translates to business outcomes. Let's get to it. To set the scene, we'll first touch on the nature of fatigue and the progression of risk towards an unintended sleep. If we picture this along a spectrum, the far left would be the hypervigilant or hyperalert state, and at the far right, clinically asleep. In all cases, except for voluntary rest, the onset of sleep begins with one or more of these microsleeps. The more common place to find ourselves on this spectrum, however, is in a generally alert state. Throughout the day or night, as fatigue sets in, we may reach a point where the first and very mild signs of cognitive impairment are detectable. These aren't the extreme symptoms of tiredness, but rather the point where we see a small but measurable increase in reaction time. If undetected and unmanaged, this may progress to a point where meaningful, near-term risk of a microsleep exists. This then gives us another way to think about the fatigue spectrum, as broken into zones. What we know from both laboratory studies and years of fatigue monitoring in a range of operations is that this transition point into the early stages of the impairment zone is the perfect time for self-management. It's this point where we can do something simple like adjust our posture, stretch our muscles, or sip some water, and we can quickly and reliably move back into the alert zone. It's this self-management that we're focusing on today. When looking at how self-management combined with fatigue monitoring works in practice, we first consider the direct experience of the equipment operator or professional driver. The most immediate risk reduction occurs the instant that the early warning alert is triggered, through two forms of external stimulus. The smart device running our app switches from its dim running mode to fully illuminated, which is coupled with a clear beep, beep, beep sound. It turns out that these two combined will usually create enough of a change in environment and represent that source of external stimulus to elicit a boost in alertness. This is kind of like the surprise we might get when a phone or doorbell rings. In certain situations, this might be paired with a small anxiety response. Say when a person's mind was beginning to wander, and the alert came as a bit of a surprise, and that slightly scary reminder of how we don't always catch ourselves letting our focus drift. So both the external stimulus and possible anxiety response can lead to a near immediate risk reduction. But there are times when this sort of anxiety-driven response is unnatural. Take, for example, a business that's created a culture where fatigue and fatigue alarms are frowned upon. The fear of progressing to a fatigue alarm in that case is exaggerated and unnecessary, and we would see this as a sign that a culture shift might be needed. To get ahead of this, we often frame the early warning as simply a tap on the shoulder. A gentle reminder that your risk is increasing and that now, right now, is the best time to self-manage. Often a supervisor sharing this message might say, "Whatever you do when you're tired, do it now. Do it at the early warning alert." What we've found though is that this can however lead to some less than ideal responses. Without any sort of guidance, experienced drivers and equipment operators will lean on the self-management tools that have proven themselves over the years. But because so many industries have a history of letting people push themselves to the limit, these self-management steps are often applied very far into that impairment zone. What's worse is that these more extreme approaches fit squarely in the unhealthy column. A common one is smoking cigarettes, not just because they're a stimulant, but because it represents just something else to do on those long drives or long shifts. Equally unhealthy is the excessive use of energy drinks or caffeine supplements, which we're learning have some pretty severe impacts on our long-term health. Before these were around, it was more common for drivers to crank the stereo until it was painfully loud to make it impossible to fall asleep, which has cost more than one person their hearing in later life. Some of the less unhealthy improvised self-management ideas are more familiar to non-professional drivers, with the most common being the humble cup of coffee. Winding down the windows or turning down the air conditioner is also popular, for a few reasons, the most common being the perception that it's harder to fall asleep if it's really cold. Many drivers report that their secret to pushing through a long drive is endless conversation with another driver over the two-way radio or hands-free phone, or when there's no one to talk to simply pick a broadcast radio station and sing at the top of their voice. So while these approaches have somewhat proven themselves anecdotally, not all of them are suitable for more timely self-management to be applied right at the early transition from the alert zone to the impairment zone. For those, we turn to what we've learnt to be both sustainable and healthy options for effective self-management. The first is the simplest, and that's simply making an adjustment of our seating position. During long periods of seated work, we tend to slouch, so activating our core muscles and sitting up straight is a great way to change things up and improve blood flow. It also turns out that sitting up straight makes it easier to breathe, which gets more oxygen to our brain, which definitely helps to keep alert. Staying hydrated is important for a range of body functions, and taking the opportunity to change things up and rehydrate is a great approach for self-managing fatigue risk. Rather than big heavy meals, having small but regular healthy snacks is better for general health, and we know that small sugar boosts can help keep us focused. This seems to work so well because of the increased blood flow that happens when we chew, and so some drivers have found that keeping breath mints on hand or chewing gum can help to turn things around and bring them back into that alert zone. Now before, I mentioned that some drivers will sing to the radio. What we know to be true is that our mind is likely to wander once we hit a song where we don't know the words. So if singing is your thing, a good tip is to set up a playlist where you like all the songs and you know all the words. The idea of a safe conversation using hands-free does seem to work well, which is why some businesses implement over-the-radio trivia sessions at regular intervals throughout their night shifts. So with all of these options, how do you choose? Well, we take the approach of sharing all of these ideas and recommending that you pick one that you expect will work and stick with it for a few weeks. If it works, keep it going. If not, try something else. What's clear is that over time, each person is able to figure out what works best for them, which happens a whole lot faster if they're able to get some objective truth in the form of real-time feedback. Now they do say that you can't manage what you don't measure, and there's certainly some truth to that. When it comes to self-management actions, we are able to measure this, and we do so. What becomes apparent quickly is that the external stimulus has a very positive effect, which when combined with some initial actions results in a high percentage of instances where individuals are able to respond to the alert and move back into the alert zone promptly. One of the most consistent insights is that this figure improves in the space of just a few weeks. And we see that this trend continues month on month. Where we stand now as a global average is a little above 97%, which really highlights that professional drivers and equipment operators both can and do self-manage when they are empowered with the right information. The end result of effective self-management is a reduction in how often a business finds itself with one or more employees at a point of risk. What we're seeing here is the effectiveness of self-management actions and the mean time between fatigue risk alarms across 6 logistics carriers. Looking at Carrier 2, the consequence of poorer self-management is significant. Now, a difference like this comes about for a range of reasons, company culture being one of them. It's been our experience that to give your workforce the best chance at self-managing and reducing the fatigue risk for themselves and your business, there's a few key areas that you can focus on. The first of these is about letting your operators and drivers know when self-management will be the most effective. Wherever possible, we don't want to rely solely on them self-assessing, which is where technologies like SmartCap can help. This all becomes a lot easier if you share some ideas with your team about what actions they can take to self-manage, which can be further reinforced through quality interactions with their supervisor. If you haven't already, check out the SmartCap webinar, which focuses solely on how to get the most out of that interaction. It's also really important to make sure that your existing or related policies don't conflict with any new guidance you provide. An example would be suggesting drivers take a sip of coffee or water when they receive an early warning alert, conflicting with another safety policy that prohibits touching or holding water bottles while driving. To take the example a little further, we've come across a business where drivers refuse to drink water as their self-management action because their remote route had no stopping points or toilet facilities. And so whether having appropriate toilets or keeping coffee making stations stocked, it's important to make sure your facilities are adequate and in line with your recommended self-management actions. Finally, going back to the idea that you can't manage what you don't measure, if you have access to data through a fatigue monitoring system, you can track how your team is going with self-management and identify the people who seem to stand out. These superstars might have some secrets up their sleeve, and by identifying them, you might be able to learn from them and share those internally. And of course, if you have crews, work groups, or entire teams who are standing out, it's always a good thing to celebrate success and improvement. In our experience, if you focus on these key points, you can really empower your workforce to self-manage their fatigue risk, which will keep everybody safer, reduce the need to intervene, and definitely will improve workforce acceptance of a real-time fatigue monitoring initiative. On that note, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to join us for today's SmartCap webinar, and hope that you're able to join us again next time. The next SmartCap webinar will be talking about how to assist your fatigued employees, with a focus on formalizing business processes to help people the most in a way that reinforces your culture of care. I hope you can join me then.